Ciao, and welcome to our 8th episode of Tuesday Tales of Terror. And I am your host, Collie Mortwood. This is part 2 of Ray Bradbury's The Skeleton. Or rather, just skeleton. There is no the. And we are following Mr. Harris and his battle that he has chosen to take up with his skeleton. This is one of my favorite Ray Bradbury stories, and I'm excited to be sharing it with you. So without further rigmarole, we shall continue. Drink water, of course, get comfy, get settled in. Let's begin. Oh, also, it's a certain evening of July where people are celebrating with exploding things in the sky. So if you hear things going on in the background, that's what it is. Mr. Harris felt buoyed up for half a day. Then he began to sag. It was all very well to blame his imagination, but this particular skeleton, by God, was fighting back. Harris set out for M. Monaghan's office late in the day. Walking for half an hour until he found the address, he caught sight of the name M. Monaghan initialed in an ancient flaking gold on a glass plate outside the building. Then his bones seemed to explode from their moorings, blasted and erupted with pain. Blinded, he staggered away. When he opened his eyes again, he had rounded a corner. M. Monaghan's office was out of sight. The pains ceased. M. Monaghan was the man to help him. If the sight of his name could cause so titanic a reaction, of course M. Monaghan must be just the man. But not today. Each time he tried to return to that to that office, the terrible pains took hold. Perspiring, he had to give up and swayed into a cocktail bar. Moving across the dim lounge, he wondered briefly if a lot of blame couldn't be put on M. Monaghan's shoulders. After all, it was M. Monaghan who'd first drawn specific attention to his skeleton and let the psychological impact of it slam home. Could M. Monaghan be using him for some nefarious purpose? But what purpose? Silly to suspect him. Just a little doctor trying to be helpful. Monaghan, his jar of breadsticks, ridiculous. M. Monaghan was okay. Okay. There was a sight within the cocktail lounge to give him hope. A large, fat man, round as a butterball, stood drinking consecutive beers at the bar. Now there was a successful man. Harris repressed a desire to go up, clap the fat man's shoulder, and inquire as to how he'd gone about impounding his bones. Yes, the fat man's skeleton was luxuriously closeted. There were pillows of fat here, resilient bulges of it there, with several round chandeliers of fat under his chin. The poor skeleton was lost. It could never fight clear of that blubber. It might have tried once, but not now. Overwhelmed, not a bony echo of the fat man's supporter remained. Not without envy, Harris approached the fat man, as one might cut across the bow of an ocean liner. Harris ordered a drink, drank it, and then dared to address the fat man. "Glands? You talking to me?" "We'll get there," asked the fat man. Or is there a special diet?" wondered Harris. "Beg your pardon, but as you see him down, can't seem to put on any weight. I'd like a stomach like that one of yours. Did you grow it because you were afraid of something?" "Well, you," announced the fat man, "are drunk." "What? I like drunkards." He ordered more drinks. "Listen close. I'll tell you. Layer by layer," said the fat man. 20 years, man and boy, I built this. He held his vast stomach like a globe of the world, teaching his audience its gastronomical geography. It was no overnight circus. The tent was not raised before dawn, and the wonders installed within. I have cultivated my inner organs as if they were thoroughbred dogs, cats, and other animals. My stomach is a fat pink Persian Tom, slumbering, rousing at intervals to purr, mew, growl, and cry for chocolate tidbits. I feed it well. It will most sit up for me. And my dear fellow, my intestines are the rarest purebred Indian anacondas you ever viewed in the sleekest, coiled, fine and ruddy health. Keep 'em in prime, I do, all my pets. For fear of something? Perhaps. This called for another drink for everyone. Gain weight. Fat Man savored the words on his tongue. Here's what you do. Get yourself a quarreling bird of a wife, a baker's dozen relatives who can flush a covey of troubles out from behind the veriest molehill. Add to these a sprinkling of business associates whose prime motivation is snatching your last lonely quid. Oh, quid. And prime motivation. Oops. And you are well on your way to getting fat. How so? In no time, you begin subconsciously building fat betwixt yourself and them. A buffer epidermal state. A cellular wall. You'll soon find that eating is the only fun on earth, but one needs to be bothered by outside sources. Too many people in this world have enough to worry about. Then they begin picking on themselves, and they lose weight. Meet all the vile, terrible people you possibly meet, and pretty soon you'll be adding the good old fat. And with that advice, the fat man launched himself up into the dark tide of night, swaying mightily and wheezing. That's exactly what Dr. Burley told me. Slightly changed, said Harris thoughtfully. Perhaps that trip to Phoenix now, at this time. The trip from Los Angeles to Phoenix was a sweltering one, crossing, as it did, the Mojave Desert on a broiling yellow day. Traffic was thin and inconstant, and for long stretches there would not be a car on the road for miles ahead or behind. Harris twitched his fingers on the steering wheel. Whether or not Creldon in Phoenix lent him the money he needed to start his business, it was still a good thing to get away, to put distance behind. The car moved in the hot sluice of desert wind. The one Mr. H sat inside the other Mr. H. Perhaps both perspired. Perhaps both were miserable. On a curve, the inside Mr. H suddenly constricted the outer flesh, causing him to jerk forward on the hot steering wheel. The car plunged off the road into boiling sand and turned half over. Night came. A wind rose. The roof was lonely and silent. The few cars that had passed went swiftly on their way, their view obstructed. Mr. Harris lay unconscious. Until very late he heard a wind rising out of the desert, felt the sting of little sand needles on his cheeks, and opened his eyes. Morning found him gritty-eyed and wandering in thoughtless, senseless circles, having, in his delirium, got away from the road. At noon he sprawled in the poor shade of a bush. The sun struck him with a keen sword edge cutting through to his bones. A vulture circled. Harris's parched lips cracked open. So that's it, he whispered, red-eyed, bristle-cheeked. One way or another. Walk me, starve me, thirst me, kill me. He swallowed dry burrs of dust. Son, cook off my flesh so you can peek out. Vultures lunge off of me, and there you'll lie, grinning with victory, like a bleached xylophone strewn and played by vultures with an ear for odd music. You'd like that. Freedom. He walked on through a landscape that shivered and bubbled in the direct pour of sunlight, stumbling, falling flat, lying to feed himself little mouths of fire. The air was blue alcohol flame, and vultures roasted and steamed and glittered as they flew in glides and circles. Phoenix, the road, car, water, safety. Hey! Someone called from way off in the blue alcohol flame. Mr. Harris propped himself up. Hey! The call was repeated, a crunching of footsteps, quick. With a cry of unbelievable relief, Harris rose, only to collapse again into the arms of someone in a uniform with a badge. The car tediously hauled, repaired. Phoenix reached. Harris found himself in such an unholy state of mind that the business transaction was a numb pantomime. Even when he got the loan and held the money in his hand, it meant nothing. This thing within him, like a hard white sword in a scabbard, tainted his business, his eating, colored his love for Clarice, made it unsafe to trust an automobile. All in all, this thing had to be put in its place. The desert incident had brushed too close, too near the bone, one might say, with an ironic twist of one's mouth. Harris heard himself thanking Mr. Creldon dimly for the money. Then he turned his car and motored back the long miles, this time cutting across to San Diego, so he would miss that desert stretch between El Centro and Beaumont. He drove north along the coast. He didn't trust that desert, but careful! Salt waves boomed, hissing on the beach outside Laguna. Sand, fish, and crustacea would cleanse his bones as swiftly as vultures. Slow down on the curves, over the surf. Damn, he was sick. Where to turn? Clarice? Burley? Munnigan? Bone specialist. Munnigan. Well? Darling! Clarice kissed him. He winced at the solidness of the teeth and jaw behind the passionate exchange. Darling, he said, slowly, wiping his lips with his wrist, trembling. You look thinner. Oh, darling, the business deal? Well, it went through, I guess. Yes, it did. She kissed him again. They ate a slow, falsely cheerful dinner with Clarice laughing and encouraging him. He studied the phone. Several times he picked it up indecisively, then laid it down. His wife walked in, putting on her coat and hat. Well, sorry, but I have to leave. She pinched him on the cheek. Come on now, cheer up. I'll be back from the Red Cross in 3 hours. You lie around and snooze. I simply have to go. When Clarice was gone, Harris dialed the phone, nervously. Monaghan? The explosions and the sickness in his body after he set the phone down were unbelievable. His bones were racked with every kind of pain, cold and hot, he had ever thought of or experienced in wildest nightmare. He swallowed all the aspirin he could find in an effort to stave off the assault. But when the doorbell rang an hour later, he could not move. He lay weak and exhausted, panting, tears streaming down his cheeks. Come in! Come in, for God's sake! M. Munnigan came in. Thank God the door was unlocked. But, oh, Mr. Harris looked terrible. M. Munnigan stood in the center of the living room, small and dark. Harris nodded. The pains rushed through him, hitting him with large iron hammers and hooks. M. Munnigan's eyes glittered as he saw Harris's protuberant bones. Ah! He saw that Mr. Harris was now psychologically prepared for aid. Was it not so? Harris nodded again, feebly, sobbing, and Munnigan still whistled when he talked, something about his tongue and the whistling. No matter. Through his shimmering eyes, Harris seemed to see M. Munnigan shrink, get smaller. Imagination, of course. Harris sobbed out his story of the Phoenix trip. M. Munnigan sympathized. The skeleton was a traitor. They would fix him once and for all.
"Oh, Monaghan," sighed Harris faintly. I I never noticed before. Your tongue, round, tube-like, a hollow. My eyes, delirious. What do I do?"
Monaghan whistled softly, appreciatively, coming closer. If Mr. Harris would relax in his chair and open his mouth. The lights were switched off. Monaghan peered into Harris's dropped jaw. Wider, please. It had been so hard that first visit to help Harris, with both body and bone in revolt. Now he had cooperation from the flesh of the man anyway, even if the skeleton protested. In the darkness, Monaghan's voice got small, small, tiny, tiny. The whistling became high and shrill. "Now, relax, Mr. Harris. Now!" Harris felt his jaw pressed violently in all directions, his tongue depressed as with a spoon, his throat clogged. He gasped for breath. Whistle. He couldn't breathe. Something squirmed, corkscrewed his cheeks out, bursting his jaws. Like a hot water douche, something squirted into his sinuses. Ears clanged. "Ah!" shrieked Harris, gagging. "Ah!" His head, its carapaces riven, shattered, hung loose. Agony shot fire through his lungs. Harris could breathe again momentarily. His watery eyes sprang wide. He shouted. His ribs, like sticks picked up and bundled, were loosened in him. Pain! He fell to the floor, wheezing out his hot breath. Lights flickered in his senseless eyeballs. He felt his limbs swiftly cast loose and free. Through streaming eyes he saw the parlor. The room was empty.
"Monaghan? Oh, in God's name, where are you? Monaghan, come help me."
Monaghan was gone. Help! Then he heard it. Deep down in the subterranean fissures of his body, the minute, unbelievable noises, little smackings and twistings and dry little chippings and grindings and nuzzling sounds, like a tiny hungry mouse down in the red-blooded dimness, gnawing ever so earnestly and expertly at what might have been, but was not, a submerged timber. Clarice, walking along the sidewalk, held her head high and marched straight toward her house on St. James Place. She was thinking of the Red Cross as she turned the corner and almost ran into this dark little man who smelled of iodine. Clarice would have ignored him if it were not for the fact that as she passed he took something long, white, and oddly familiar from his coat and proceeded to chew on it as on a peppermint stick. Its end devoured, his extraordinary tongue darted within the white confection, sucking out the filling, making contented noises. He was still crunching his goody as she proceeded up the sidewalk to her house, turned the doorknob, and walked in. "Darling," she called, smiling round. "Darling, where are you?" She shut the door, walked down the hall, and into the living room. "Darling." She stared at the floor for 20 seconds, trying to understand. She screamed. Outside, in the sycamore darkness, the little man pierced a long white stick with intermittent holes. Then, softly sighing, his lips puckered, played a little sad tune upon the improvised instrument to accompany the shrill and awful singing of Clarice's voice as she stood in the living room. Many times as a little girl, Clarice had run on the beach sands, stepped on a jellyfish, and screamed. It was not so bad finding an intact, gelatin-skinned jellyfish in one's living room. One could step back from it. It was when the jellyfish called you by name. And that is the end of Skeleton by Ray Bradbury. Spooky. Well, my loves, I think we're going to call it an early evening. thank you so much for joining. And I hope that if you do celebrate something on this particular July evening, that you have done it safely and that you still have all of your fingers and toes and that nothing has burned down. In the meantime, I will see you. Yes, I will see you next week. The 11th. I don't know. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. Okay, I love you very deeply. It is with love. Wishing you peace. Stay spooky. Carry on. Go on your way. Get out of here. Ciao, ciao, ciao.